what you see up here is a new slide to you, in that it now plots the course ahead. Let me go back one. This is the one you've been seeing for the last 3 years, as we made progress from the Stone Age and Sid's favorite term, prehistory, forward through last month when we finished up absolutism. And that leads us now to the next phase, which will carry us through the end of the 19th century. And it's going to take us a while to get there. It took us 3 years to do that whole first slide. It's going to take us probably about that long to do this slide. So it's 100 years represented on this slide, 120 or so, I guess. And it'll take us as long to do that as all of the preceding centuries took us to go through. So we're going to do the Enlightenment today. Enlightenment is an interesting period where we have intellectuals competing with scientists. The scientific age, which we'll do in a couple months, is going on simultaneous to this. This is Isaac Newton and gravity and all of that business that's going on, Boyle and the gases and all of that that's going on. And it's going on parallel to this. And what appears to be the case is that the philosophers are envious of the scientists. The scientists are doing all this great thinking, coming up with all these good ideas, and the philosophers feel that they can probably do the same. It inspires them to get going. Kind of like the Renaissance inspired the age of exploration. That kind of feeding happened. And as you know, one of the things I emphasize in my history class, and I'll emphasize here, is history is not so much memorizing dates and names and places as it is understanding the cause and effect and why something happens, because something happened previous, and something happened previous to that, and something happened previous to that. And that's the case with the Enlightenment. Scientists making great discoveries, the philosophers say we can do that too, about people. And so that's what we're going to investigate. And that Enlightenment is going to be the inspiration for the American Revolution. You'll see that the ties are absolutely crystal clear. You're going to see them today. The American Revolution inspires the French Revolution, which is going to inspire other revolutions around the globe through the early 1800s. And monarchies is on its last legs, is the long and the short of this, except in England. Okay, it'll be forever in England. Won't it be interesting? I hope it happens in my I hope it does anyway, in our lifetime, my lifetime, to see what happens after Queen Elizabeth in England, to see what the English are going to do about that. Because, you know, the more you read about it, you get the impression that they're getting more and more exhausted with funding the royal family, and especially what the royal family's been through the last 4 or 5 years. So that's just an aside. It'll be interesting to see. But we do have a couple of monarchies out there that are still beating. Okay, the Enlightenment. So let's talk a little bit about it. We're not talking about athletes here. You know, go back to your high school class and envision the really nerdy kids that are really coming up with really weird things to do and think about. That's the philosophers in the Enlightenment, all right? These are not the cricket players. These are not, you know, they're not out riding horses and chasing foxes and doing all the rest of that manly kind of stuff that they were doing during this period of time. They're like this, thinking about stuff and writing about stuff. But it's going to be their ideas that change the course of history. Certainly change the course of history in regards to what happens to us and our founding fathers. So, also known as the Age of Reason, and like as I said, like the scientists, they're trying to come up with a better way to rule and govern mankind. And the reason we did absolutism right before we do this period is because I hope you got the impression that people were getting more and more upset, more and more frustrated with the monarchies, and why it was also an inspiration to these people to think we got to come up with a way to do this better. And that's what this whole period is about. How do we better govern humankind? And that's what it's after. Okay, we're going to do 2 countries principally, England and France, which is where the major philosophical centers existed. And I'm going to ask you some questions. You still get to eat dinner if you don't know the answers to these questions, but it's it's going to be, I think, so blatantly obvious to you where some of our ideas come from based upon what these philosophers are thinking about. Okay, Thomas Hobbes. Interesting guy. He believes that everybody is born bad. He definitely buys into the concept of original sin, that we spring from the womb as evil people that, left to our own devices, would kill, rape, plunder, steal, lie, cheat. You just pick an activity on the negative side of the spectrum, and we do it. So his belief is because we are born bad, government has to be strong enough to keep us all under control. His book is called Leviathan. You see that here? What does a Leviathan normally mean? When you've seen Leviathan in literature, what are they talking about? Or the Bible. What is Leviathan in the Bible? Sea monsters. The whale that ate Jonah was, supposedly well, didn't eat him, kind of swallowed him for a little while. Was called Leviathan. Well, his book, Leviathan, implies that whoever it is, and he is not necessarily opposed to monarchy, he just wants a government that's big enough, bold enough, strong enough, willing enough to control all the people. And the inside portrait that is on the inside cover of this book is this. And this is his idea. So we have the people and we have the city down here below. We have the king, which is represented him, and he has two principal roles. And it's the two principal roles that rulers have adopted to themselves throughout history. One is justice in peacetime, keeping the peace, and winning the war when the time comes to win the war. And he said, as long as you have this situation where you have this big, bad, bold government watching over the people and keeping the peace, and then winning the war when the bad guys show up, we're going to be fine. So you're born bad, and you got to have big government. Because we're born bad, without this government, this is probably his most famous quote, without this big government controlling, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Because everybody would be killing everybody else. Now, one thing I'd like to point out to the kids, and they saw this periodically as we went through the year, was that occasionally in literature, oftentimes in movies, people who are historically literate, screenwriters, in this case newspaper writers, will play with you, expecting you to understand a literary reference. And here's a case back in 04. I was teaching in 04, and this campus is the race between Bush and Kerry. And the editor of the San Antonio Express-News was playing with us. This election is going to be nasty, brutish, and those of us who are literarily literate know what's coming next. Short. But he plays with us. He says, I love doing this. What percentage of the population of San Antonio, Texas, saw this headline and understood, oh yeah, that's Thomas Hobbes, I know who that is. He's the guy who thought we were all born bad. He said nasty, brutish, and clever. Good job, Mr. Editor. Do you think, what, 10% of his audience? Well, it's probably more than that. But anyway, not probably the 100% that we'd all like it to be. But nasty, brutish, and short. So, he proposes a social contract. Now, this is going to be one of two social contracts that we talk about today. The other one is going to be offered to us by Rousseau. But this social contract says that because we good people want the protection of a strong government, in exchange for what that strong government has to do to protect us, we have to give up some of our rights. So the social contract in Hobbes' mind is, government, please protect me. I'm going to give up some rights for you to protect me. How is Thomas Hobbes alive and well today in San Antonio, Texas? Well, or anywhere in the United States?
Judge Wolf.
What happens at airports? What happens at airports? When you go up, and the TSA guy says, take off your shoes, take off your belt, do this, that, and the other. Are you sacrificing some of your personal freedom for the protection that they are offering you? Absolutely. This is Thomas Hobbes at work here. Now, when you go up to the TSA guy, I wouldn't recommend saying thank you for executing Thomas Hobbes' philosophy or whatever, but that is what's going on. Now, for those of you who can't see, air travel in the future, because of all the restrictions, you can't wear all this stuff in the airplane. And finally, the guys, they're all wearing fig leaves here because that's all they got last time. Sorry, there's a terror plot involving fig leaves, which means, you know, total nudity on the airplane coming up. But this is Thomas Hobbes at work, and that's the social contract that we have accepted for our protection against the people who are born bad and can't control those nasty instincts. John Locke. Now, when I was teaching, you know, a decade or so ago, there was a TV show called Lost on, and the character who was John Locke in that series is this gentleman here. So when I introduced this and said we're going to be talking about John Locke today, the girls, yeah, they got all excited. They thought this was going to be the best class all year. We're going to have John Locke, but it's not that John Locke. John Locke is English, and he proposed that man is born with 3 rights that the government should protect. So what do you think those rights were that were proposed by Mr. Locke? Somebody say it out loud. It's coming from here somewhere. Say it, Jack.
Life, liberty, and property protection.
And property protection. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Where does that come from? Declaration of Independence. Who wrote that? Thomas Jefferson. Do you think Thomas Jefferson was reading John Locke? Absolutely. I will credit the Founding Fathers with brilliance in applying the writings of the philosophers to our unique situation in the Americas. Theirs is not total original thought. They do plagiarize, but when they do, they change it just a little bit to adopt it to our circumstances. Locke did not say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said life, liberty, and property. Why would a guy in England say that we are born with the right to own property? How many people in England own property in the 17th century, 18th century? There are fewer than 100 families that own all of the land in England when he is writing this. So he feels it's not fair. I want to own a farm, but I can't because these other people own this. So in England, I believe that you should be owned, or you should have the right to own property. Do we have that issue in America? Just look west. How much land is out there? I mean, just keep looking west, and there's all that land out there. So Thomas Jefferson looks at that, but he says, property, that's not applicable to us. But what is? The pursuit of happiness. So Thomas Jefferson reads this guy, takes his words, applies it to the American experience, and we have his expression of what those unalienable rights are. And then Locke further goes on to say that it's the people's responsibility that if the government isn't protecting those rights for us, that we, the people, have the right and the responsibility to get a new government, all right, to do something different. So that's John Locke, and that's his impression or his impact on us. There is some women's rights going on. Some of you may have known of Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote opinion pieces for the most part, a couple of books where she argued that women have the right to education because they are as intelligently gifted as men are and should have the opportunity to participate in government. It's not a name that rolls off the tongue easily or smoothly. Excuse me, the mountain cedar is aggressive. Now, when we get to the Romantic Age, we're going to talk about some authors, and one of them is going to be Mary Shelley. And Mary Shelley famously wrote Frankenstein. It's interesting that a woman would write Frankenstein, but that's the case. And she is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft had a romantic affair with a ship captain. And she got pregnant. And she was in a very liberal society. Her friends were very liberal. And of course they all expected her to, carry the child through. And she chickened out. Because being a bastard, even back then, being a bastard 1,000 years ago in Europe was bad enough. But being even in this period, in the 17th and 18th centuries, being a bastard is still not something you want to be. And so literally a week before she gave birth, she married the sea captain so that her daughter would not be a bastard. And her liberal friends basically cast her out because they thought that she had committed treason against their movement or whatever they thought. But that's Mary Shelley. We'll talk more about her as we get a little bit deeper into this. Okay, let's go to France. Philosophers there are called philosophes. Not rocket science there. Philosophy comes from the Greek meaning lovers of wisdom. I'd like you all to be called philosophes, not because you're deep in the liberal slice of things, but just because you love wisdom. So when somebody calls you a philosopher, take it as a compliment, because and appreciate the lover of wisdom aspect of that. They're almost universally atheist. They believe that the monarchies have used the church to help control the people, and they're absolutely right from that aspect. So most all of them are going to be atheists, and that runs afoul. This is still, even though the Reformation has happened, even though the Presbyterian Church is, Protestant churches and denominations are getting stronger, the Catholic Church still has great impact in Europe, and to say that you're an atheist and the church is not going to like it. Whose books are, because the church is still going to be banning books this late in history, and most all of their books are going to be banned. These philosophers are going to be excommunicated from the church, and so that continues to be the policy of the church as these two battle with one another. They favor what is called Enlightened Absolutism. I've used this term before, especially when we talked about Maria Theresa in Austria, that what they are after is a leader. And some of them say it's okay if you're going to be a king or a queen, but we want you to be enlightened. In other words, like we've talked about before, where you wake up in the morning and say, what can I do for the people of France today? As opposed to, what can I do for Louis XVI today? And as long as you felt that way about ruling your people, then they were okay with that. It's just that how many monarchs in history had that kind of philosophy or that kind of attitude, as opposed to being exploitive of the people and what money they can get. So they are opposed to absolute monarchy. They don't like this divine right that God specifically put this person to be in the womb of the queen, to be born to be the ruler of the country. They don't buy into that. Some are atheists, deny the existence of God. Excuse me, let me go back here. And some are deists that believe in God, but reject the idea that God sees the fall of every sparrow. That He listens to your prayers, so they said they don't buy into that. Isaac Newton, who we'll talk about in a couple months, was a deist. He believed in the creation. He believed that God was there. But his idea was that once God got things going, every once in a while he goes fishing or plays golf or whatever for a while, then comes back and checks on and see if there's a little tweaking that needs to be done, tweaks it, and then goes back and plays the back nine. So that's kind of how Isaac Newton looked at this. So that's what these are. And so this irritates the church. These people who are garnering great popularity among the people, especially the common people, have that kind of opinion about the church. Okay, Voltaire, this name. He's just a famous philosopher. That's his pen name. That's not his real name. He is the one who is probably the greatest influence on Jefferson. And why, when we come to, and those who feel that individual rights need to be protected by our governmental documents. And so when it comes time, and you know this, that when the Constitution is ratified in 1787, there's the argument that it doesn't do enough in this regard. And they take the example of Voltaire. Voltaire doesn't lay out in his writings what the Bill of Rights should be for a person. But he definitely says you got to be able to, the government has got to guarantee these personal rights to people. And so that is considered to be the genesis of the idea for our Bill of Rights, and so that's where those come from, or at least he gets credit for that. He also, this is his freedom of speech comment. I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Is this a common philosophy in the United States of America today? We're kind of running afoul of this one, I think, right now. But you know, I asked the students this. I said, you know, I know some of you may disagree with this comment, that here I am, you know, combat veteran, served in the Army for 25 years. My dad served, my brother served, brother-in-law served, daughter-in-law served. I believe that a person has the right to burn the flag because I gave it to them. And I may disagree with it, and I may hate the act to its core, but that's what Voltaire said. I'm not necessarily saying I'm a big Voltaire fan, but I do believe that. And it may be a surprise to some of you, but that's just where I stand on this. And we see a lot of thought to the contrary in regards to that today, especially from the folks who control the media, that if you disagree with them, we're just going to, you can't talk. You know, we see it on college campuses where conservative people have been signed up by the administration to come talk to the students, and the one side, the liberal side of the campus, rises up and says, no, we're not going to have these people here. Rather than having them in, and letting the students have a healthy discourse about the difference of opinions, and thereby strengthening their ability to make reasonable decisions for themselves, I think is very disappointing. And it runs absolutely contrary to this. But anyway, so we're thankful to Voltaire for that. The king didn't like him. The church doesn't like him. He gets excommunicated, he gets kicked out, he gets exiled, he spends 28 years outside of Paris, exiled from the city, where he survives smallpox, as you say. So he returns in 1778. He's in his 80s, and people say, Voltaire, it's so nice to have you back in town. Come to this party, meet these young ladies. Come to this party, meet these young ladies. It kills him, literally. I mean, he parties, you know, he wanted to say, I'm going to party myself today. That's literally what happened to Voltaire. I mean, he finds that at 84, he's not 30-something anymore, and he literally parties himself to death. So, yeah. Glenn Glass has said many times to me that this is how he wants to go. Okay, Montesquieu. He argues that power should not be concentrated in one particular place in government, as in the king. And he argues that it would be better to have separation of powers. Now, he doesn't actually say, United States, when you get formed, you need a legislative and executive and judicial branch, but he does say in his writings that for a government to be effective, that power needs to be spread out so that there are checks and balances and there are controls on it. So we give Montesquieu credit, well, and we give our founding fathers credit with understanding. Well, let's give Montesquieu credit first for recommending that you have these separation of powers into branches of government, but we credit our founders with once again applying that to our particular situation and saying, okay, it's going to be judicial, legislative, executive, and this is how we're going to break it down. And of course we have, you know, that's kind of a little complex diagram there in the lower left that expresses a very simple idea that all of these branches, by concept, have equal powers, and they have the ability to check one another, be it in the passage of laws, the ruling of constitutionality, the vetoing of laws. All of that is interwoven to give them all equal powers. And when we have a healthy functioning government, as we have had for most of our existence, that has worked effectively. So that idea comes from Montesquieu. Rousseau, he comes up with the idea of direct democracy. And by direct democracy, we mean one person, one vote, and you vote on everything. Now, this concept, when we talk about applying this concept to us, it works well in the colonies when they're young. And you have a small village, let's go to Plymouth. At a small village, population a couple hundred, you know, early on in its existence. Who gets to vote there? Women get to vote? Not yet. Kids get to vote? No. Men get to vote? Which men? Property owners. So we're not, we kind of have a direct democracy, but we're not there yet. But anyway, let's just stay in Plymouth. We have a direct democracy. The men who own property are eligible to vote. They vote on virtually everything. That's a direct democracy. Do we have a direct democracy in the United States today? We do in some circumstances. Every person in San Antonio votes for the mayor, right? And the governor, right? So that's direct democracy. But for the most part, we have indirect democracy, which means that we pick people to do what for us? Vote. Yeah, make the decisions and vote for us. That's the indirect democracy. So the direct democracy that is proposed here by Rousseau works well when you have a population that can address an issue and then the vote be managed, you know, reasonably. But when the population gets to the point you can't do that anymore, that's when you resort to what we have, which is more of an indirect democracy than that. So he presents the social contract. So, let me give you an example of where population comes in. Tomorrow we're driving to Colorado, and we will go through Ballinger, Texas. And we will drive by the county courthouse in Ballinger, Texas. Population 2,500 maybe. When they wanted to repaint the trim on the courthouse in Ballinger, Texas, do you think that everybody probably had a vote in that situation? I would wager they would. I would wager that they probably said, okay, who wants beige, who wants yellow, who wants light pale green, whatever. When they painted the library in downtown San Antonio, what do they call that? Taco brown? Enchilada, that's right. Enchilada, whatever that enchilada color is that. Did we all in San Antonio get a chance to vote on that? No. You know, there were our representatives down there that voted on that. So that's where, you know, you get to the point where you have the difference between the two. So his social contract is, the rule is, when everybody votes, how do you decide who wins? You count the votes and who wins? Whoever has the most votes, right? This is one of those simple things where this is his social contract. The will of the majority will rule. And you say, well, isn't that, isn't that obvious? Well, like everything in history, somebody's got to do it for the first time. And it is Rousseau that we give credit to, saying, okay, yeah, everybody's going to vote, and whoever has the most votes, the majority wins. And you say, well, I could have done that if I lived back there, and you'd be talking about me in history club. That's true, but you weren't. So you need to come up with a brilliant new idea that somebody's going to talk about 500 years from now and be as famous as what Rousseau is. Okay, so how does this stuff get disseminated? Obviously, there are pamphlets, there are magazines, but there are two things that are going on in France that have a lot to do with the way that these ideas are disseminated. One is the Encyclopedia. This is an effort by Denis Diderot. It takes him, what does it say, 21 years to compile 28 volumes, 17 of which he personally wrote. And it's a little bit of everything or anything about everything. Now the illustrations I have up here, the middle one is an article that was in that encyclopedia about how to run a tannery shop and all the tools and all that is needed. This is an article about how to mine for, these are veins of coal, and how you best mine for veins. I mean, that is the kind of stuff that's in here, in addition to the philosophical writings of all of these philosophes and Hobbes and those people. Because it is so liberal in thought, because it advocates the overthrow of monarchies, he too is going to be excommunicated. But this book, this collection of articles, becomes the foundation for liberal thought in Europe. And this is how vociferous Diderot is about the church and about the government. The natural order of man will be achieved when the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. I wonder what he thinks about the Catholic Church and kings in general. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. So, any doubt why he is not favored by the monarchs of Europe or the Catholic Church? So, that's just an indication of where he stands. A second thing that is happening in Paris is a social competition between wealthy ladies hosting gatherings such as this, called salons, wherein they invite philosophers to come into their home and address their friends in the gathering. So you will see Montesquieu here, you will see Crusoe here, you will see Voltaire here, addressing these people. And these ladies compete for having the best or the most well-known philosophers in town come to her salon and address them. Now, the most famous of these, this is a painting of a salon, and you go on, if you're really curious about that, there are a couple of these paintings that literally identify by person some of these people that we've been talking about in this crowd. But the lady who's hosting this particular one here is this lady in the black scarf. Her name is Madame GeoFrame, and she is held to be the most important salonnière of the time because she's won the competition, and these people come to her salon more frequently and draw better crowds than anyone else. So this is the type photo or notation that I talk about, which identifies these famous philosophers that were here. One of the reasons she devotes so much energy is this: one, she has a wealthy husband, but two, she marries her husband when she's 14. Her husband's 48. He is the business partner of her father. And to settle a business deal, she's basically the collateral. And so it's a loveless marriage, reflected by the fact up here that at one salon, one of her friends said, "Who's the gentleman sitting over in the corner?" And she famously responded, "Oh, that's my husband, he is dead." Now, he wasn't literally, but to her, he was. And so that kind of reflects the status of their relationship. Fortunately, Pam hasn't said that about me yet, so I'm thankful for that. It's probably coming, but it just hasn't come yet. So this was kind of her schedule. Monday, she had artists and musicians. Wednesday, poets and philosophers. And she generally invited, and was very successful. So people come, they listen to these people talk, and they go out and say, "Oh, I heard the other night." And it's just word of mouth type of spreading, in addition to the magazines, pamphlets, newspapers, all the rest that's spreading these ideas. Okay, so while that is going on, art is happening, music is happening, and literature is happening. So that's how we're going to wrap this up today. Just kind of give you an idea, put it in context. All these famous artistes that you know about are operating in this period of time. So Baroque art. You've heard this Baroque business? I think in my college time, there were, I would go into some homes and there would be some Baroque decorations there. You'd go into a place like the library at the university and it would be kind of Baroque looking at some of the older universities. The painting style, you see a couple of examples up here. It's very gaudy. A lot of colors, a lot of things going on in the painting. They routinely affect significant historical events, significant people. Saints. This one, this is King Charles, who's being led out of Parliament on his way to what will end up being his execution that we talked about last month. So it's going to be historical figures, historical events presented in a very colorful, gaudy kind of thing. A lot of detail. I have absolutely not an ounce of artistic blood in my body, and I sit down here and I say, okay, so where does this artist start with this one? Okay, what is his first stroke on this painting? Or are there any of these paintings like this? I mean, does he do this right here? And then what's his vision of how that fits into all of this? It's amazing to me that people can, on a piece of canvas with oil, do this. Not that I'm attracted to this. You're not going to see the Baroque painting hanging in our living room. But it is still fascinating to me that that level of detail and gaudiness exists. Music. I also have absolutely no I may, but I just never pursued it. That just wasn't. Hard to play the piano when you're in second base. You know, it's just that it doesn't work. But it fascinates me. This really, you know, I appreciate the mathematical aspects of music. That if this represents a piece of music written by Beethoven, Bach, pick 'em, back, what, 200-300 years ago, that this right here can be played by a musician today and translated into the sound that existed 200 or 300 years ago when this guy wrote it. That is magical to me, who have absolutely no musical talent whatsoever. How the notes that are reflected here on this piece of paper can be used to reproduce the sound that was created 200 or 300 years ago. It's genius. There's nothing short of that. So when we get ready to talk about these composers, just very briefly, understand I hold them in high reverence, as I do any musician today that can translate this to produce the music that first was heard 200 or 300 years ago. Okay, Mozart, generally held to be the greatest composer of all time, one, because of how prolific he was, and two, the tragedy of his early death at 35, and what he could have produced had he lived a normal lifespan. As it is, he writes 626 pieces of music. He starts when he's 5 years old. He writes his first opera when he's 12. What were you doing when you were 5 years old? You know, it's not this. That's not what I'm doing when I'm 5 years old, but that's what he's doing. So he is from Vienna. It becomes what is considered to be the capital city of classical music. The little cartoon says, another symphony, Wolfgang Splendid. What is it called? And of course, what we have here is the first symphony, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. See, I mean, that's all he does is he numbers them, you know, up to however many. So some things about him: 6 brothers and sisters, but only his sister lives, who's his older sister. So wrote music at 5, opera at 12, 626. From 7 to 10, over that 3-year period, he performs for virtually every crowned head of Europe. His dad takes him on tour with his sister. This is the Traveling Mozart show. And they literally, well, they perform music, but they also do tricks. And Mozart, being the little genius as he is, you imagine 7 to 10. Imagine your grandkids, or your kids, whatever, when they were 7 to 10. Imagine yourself when you're 7 to 10. You're playing for the King of England. And Mozart's dad says to the crowd, I know we have some accomplished musicians here. I invite any of you to come up and play an original piece of music right now. And of course, with the king there are going to be people who volunteer to do that. So one person comes up, he plays this little 3-minute piece of music. Mozart, at 7 years old, is watching. And when the guy finishes and goes and sits down to great applause, 7-year-old Mozart gets up there and plays the exact same piece of music from memory. It's amazing. Never heard it before. It's not written down. He just remembers it, and he plays it. He can get up underneath the keyboard, you know, and play upside down and backwards. That's what I mean by tricks. But an amazing, just an incredible talent. I think that some of you have probably seen the movie Amadeus, which is about him. You know, it came out, what, gosh, a long time ago now, 25, 30 years ago. Terrific movie, but it shows some of this. So he has 6 kids, 4 of whom die. Unfortunately, he does not, his relationship with his dad is not good. We have truly one of these parents, we would call him the stage parent today, where the dad is living vicariously through his son. And it's a very tight, controlled kind of relationship. And then, when his mom wanted to go on one of these trips just to see what was happening, Mozart wanted mom to come, so he convinces dad, yeah, let mom come along. Well, she dies on the trip to Paris. And the dad then, forever, until he dies, holds Mozart responsible for his mother's death. And of course, towards his wife's death. So the relationship between the two is not good. He does strings for the most part, violins, cellos, string quartets. Beethoven, of course, what is the famous thing about Beethoven? What happens to him physically? You point up here, Jeff, goes deaf. And again, the genius of these people, just by feeling the vibrations, you know, on the piano when he's playing, he understands what it would probably sound like and is able to compose music accordingly. It's a level of genius that I can't imagine. I spent not a lot more time, but a little bit more time with the students in this, because you can see, you know, these little symbols down here in the corner. I had pieces of music here, and on the test, I actually played pieces of music and had them identify who the composer was. So for at least 2 or 3 weeks, in a period of time, or a week, I had kids actually recognize Bach and Beethoven and that. And I got a kick out of them understanding that, gosh, this isn't hip hop, all right, or whatever, but there is, you know, some attraction to it. I loved it when I played the William Tell Overture for them, you know, Lone Ranger. How can you sit here in your desk and not have your feet tapping and riding that horse like the Lone Ranger did? Bach, very deep, of course, organ music. And then Handel. Handel, from Germany, was the court musician for George II of England. Remember when we talked about England, I said when Princess or Queen Anne died without an heir, they had to go to Germany, to the Hanoverian line, and get the King of England to come from Germany. And he came. George I spoke no German, he spoke no English. So George II is his son. He's now the king. He contracts with Handel to write the Messiah. And so it's famously performed for George II the first time, and it takes about an hour and 15 minutes for this initial performance for that to happen. And famously, when they get to the Hallelujah chorus, which is toward the end of the Messiah, George II has a bad back, and he feels the need to stretch. So just by coincidence, as the Hallelujah chorus starts, George II stands up, and when the king stands up, everybody stands up. So when you go to a performance of Handel's Messiah today, and you get to the Hallelujah chorus, what usually happens among the learned members of the audience? They stand up. Because George II did, after all, so George II did, I'm going to stand up for it too. But that's the respectful aspect then of a performance of the Messiah when it happened. Okay, and then very shortly I'll just point out a couple of authors to you so that you can put them in context here. Okay, you know about these authors. Some of you have read these authors. I think I've shared this with you before, but it's good to reinforce it here. Our history book, the World History book for Texas high school sophomores, 950 pages. And you were, as a teacher, you were tasked to complete that book in a year. So it's kind of racehorse kind of history, but anyway, that's what we did. But as I read the book the first, the year, and then doing my lesson planning, there were some books in there that I had heard about my entire life, and all of a sudden here they are in history. I said, gosh, I guess I better finally read these books. So I made it my goal, and it took about the first 6 or 7 years that I was teaching to read the books that were mentioned in the history book that I had never read before. Guess which one, starting in college, I said, I'm always going to read this summer. What's that book? Very long book. War and Peace by Tolstoy. I finally read War and Peace. Those of you who have not actually read War and Peace, just read the war parts. Tolstoy, the book is about Napoleon invading Russia in 1812. Tolstoy does a good job with the war part, but he's at the terrible part, because the other part's the romance, who's breaking whose heart and all the wars going on. Terrible, stinky, but, it's still a classic. So anyway, so all of these books I finally got around reading, and you know what I found? They're really good. You know, it's not the John Grisham or the David Baldacci or Vince Flynn or any of that. It's not that genre. But I mean, there's a reason that they're classics and considered to be as impactful as what they are. All right, Gulliver's Travels. I'm not going to ask, but I doubt that very many of you have literally read Gulliver's Travels. It is a satire of life in Europe. Jonathan Swift writes it. He's going to make fun of the crown. He's going to make fun of the church. He's going to make fun of bankers. He's going to make fun of lawyers. He's going to make fun of farmers. I mean, you pick it, he's going to make fun of it. And that's why it becomes popular. It's kind of like Saturday Night Live 200 years ago. That kind of a deal. And so when you don't have television, you don't have the internet, you don't have Saturday Night Live to watch, you want something, a piece of literature that's going to entertain you, and that's what Gulliver's Travel does. It's kind of slow-paced, you know, compared to what our pace of life is today, but that's basically what this is. People enjoy having people in powers of influence or of power being made fun of, and that's what Jonathan Swift does in this. And he uses a character that is going to, it's fascinated me, he gets shipwrecked or thrown off of ships 5 different times. He survives all of them, comes back to England, and guess what? He gets on another ship and goes and gets shipwrecked, or something happens to him again. And he keeps ending up in all these different places. These are 2 of them. There's an island that is literally in the sky that he visits. He visits a place where he's the size, he fits in one of their teacups. What's the most famous one that he goes to, though? What is it? You guys are saying it. Go ahead and say it. Where he's a giant, and everybody else is like 6 inches tall? Lilliputian, right? And these are the Lilliputians. And as is the case in other, we're going to see this in a couple of places. Words that we use today comes from literature at this time. So when you say Lilliputian today, you know, it means small. And I would tell the kids, I mean, if there's somebody that's harassing you, counter with something like, you have a really Lilliputian intellect. And they'll look at you and say, well, thank you very much. Because they won't know the difference. So I always told the kids, guys, I want you to be nerds. All right? I really do. There's a lot of fun in being a nerd. Not to act like it and get beat up by all the tough guys, but be a nerd in that you are attracted to things that are intellectual, that you read and all of that. Be a nerd. The rewards are wonderful, especially if you can tell some guy he has a Lilliputian intellect and think it's a compliment. So, you know, I think the latest version of this, Jack Black is the one that's tied down here. The actor is tied down here on the left-hand side of this. And I think that's been the last time that Hollywood has attempted to do anything with this one. The other phrase that came out of this, he visits a land where the horses are the smart ones, and they talk. And the man-ape creatures are basically, well, they're not mute, but they don't speak. They don't have a language, and they are called Yahoos. And so when someone calls you a Yahoo, there he is, right there. All right, it's this guy, all right, who doesn't talk and he works for horses, and that comes from Gulliver's Travels. Do you think they make these things? So why do they have a chocolate drink named Yahoo? I have no idea where that comes from, but chances are not someone that has any sort of literary credentials. Okay, Robinson Crusoe, famous story. Guy, shipwrecked. Another way of shipwrecked. Today they would be airplane crashes, right? But back then, the principal dangerous mode of travel to go any place of distance was by ship. So anytime you're going to place somebody in peril, if you're a writer, then chances are it's going to be they're on a ship and they've got a shipwreck. So Robinson Crusoe is a businessman. He has interest in the Caribbean, and he is sailing back to Europe. He is shipwrecked, and he's the only survivor. So he is going to survive on this island in the Caribbean for 28 years. And in that period, toward the end, he's about 4 years short of what is going to be his eventual rescue. He is in the habit of going up on top of the hill, and this supposedly, I have this photo here because if Robinson Crusoe had been stranded on an island, this is literally what learned people say the island would be. I mean, this literal island, given what the route that the ship is projected in the book, I mean, there's some nerdy people out there that look into this kind of stuff, but that's what they think. So anyway, Robinson Crusoe is in the habit of going up on the tall ground. He has a pile of firewood that's there. And if he ever sees a ship on the horizon, he lights it up. It presents smoke, and hopefully, someone's going to come and pick him up. They don't for the first 25 years. Well, he's up there one day, and he looks down, and there's an island in the distance, and from that island is a flotilla of canoes coming toward him, and he watches it, and he's not interested in doing anything until he finds out what's going on. They have 3 captives, and it becomes clear as things start to progress that they are cannibals, and they're about ready to eat these guys. They're going to cook them and eat them. And so Robinson Crusoe decides he's going to, well, I've lived here for 25 years, I don't know that I want to live here for another 25. He decides to try to do something about it. And so he goes down, and then in the fight, frees the 3 guys, and the 4 guys against the 10 guys, and they render them all dead or unconscious. 2 of the 3 that he rescued are killed. So the only ones that are left are Robinson Crusoe and this one guy. And the one guy, as they start to learn to communicate with one another, pledges himself to Robinson Crusoe because he saved his life. And Robinson Crusoe gives him the name Friday. And he gives him that name, why? Because he's been keeping a calendar, and as best he can reckon, he saved this fellow on Friday. So that's why he gives him the name. To the extent that when they are finally rescued, Robinson Crusoe offers Friday the opportunity to be taken back to his home island, and he declines. And Friday goes back to Europe and becomes the trusted manservant then of Robinson Crusoe. So it's a great adventure story. Again, if you haven't literally read it, I recommend it to you. It's a good story. A lot more philosophical thought in there than car chases, but it's still worthy of your attention. So when someone has said, "You're my man Friday," or "my girl Friday," it's meant to be a compliment, because he is very steadfast, he's very loyal, he's very dedicated, and that's why I told the kids, I mean, when you start out at work, be worthy of your boss saying, "You're my guy or my gal Friday." Not that you're a sycophant or anything of that sort, but that you're just loyal, dedicated, and hard worker. Okay? All right. That's the Enlightenment. So when we come back next week, or next month, we're going to do the American Revolution, because that is, of course, what is inspired by this. And so we're going to talk about Paul Revere and all the rest of that. Okay? Again, I really appreciate your dedication to this and your continuing bravery to show up and eat chicken fried steak and the rest of that. So, okay? Thank you.